This just happened a few nights ago, and I'm still shaken up. I'm a female bartender at a small cafe that doubles as a venue. During the day, we serve coffee and lunch, and at night we have a full bar with bands and comedy shows. The other night, we were hosting an open mic comedy show. There weren't that many comedians there, so we ended up closing early, and I was ready to go home. During the show, one patron had come in and ordered a single beer. He was acting nervous towards me, but being a female bartender, I encounter plenty of male customers who are shy or don't like talking to women, so I didn't think much about it. He just sat down, sipped his beer, and watched the show. Since we had closed early, most customers had already left, and I was just escorting the last couple out of the bar. When I was getting ready to lock the door, I saw the man from earlier walk down the back hallway into the men's room. Less than a minute later, he burst through the door, yelling, "Hurry, come back here, I need help!" I stayed at the opposite end of the hallway and asked him what was wrong. "The toilet's overflowing, there's water all over the floor, help me clean this up." I was immediately suspicious, so I just stayed far down the hallway from him and replied, "It's okay, man, it happens, I'll mop it up, I'm just trying to close up right now." He continued to argue with me, trying to get me to come into the bathroom with him as I stood as far away as possible. Finally, he aggressively walked towards me and reached for my arm. "You need to come back here now," he said. I put my hands out in front of me to prevent him from coming any closer and told him he had to leave. I was relieved that he simply left when I asked him to. I locked the door behind him as soon as he walked outside. When I checked the bathroom, it was completely spotless. No water on the floor at all. After flushing the toilet and urinal and confirming that they were both working just fine, I started to get nervous. Just in case, I pulled out my pocket knife and clipped it to my belt loop. As I was cleaning the espresso machine and putting toppers on the liquor bottles, I heard a tapping noise at the front of the store. Through the large front window, I could see the same man tapping the window, waving at me and laughing like a maniac. He walked over to the door and pulled on it, but when he realized I had already locked it, he started screaming and pounding on the glass. Fight overcame flight at that point, and I hurried around the counter and walked about 6 feet from the door. I pulled out my knife and locked eyes with him and yelled that I was calling the cops. He smiled and walked away. Instantly, all of my adrenaline just crashed. I locked myself in the back office and called 911 crying, explaining that I was all alone and a man was trying to lure me into the bathroom and was outside trying to get into the bar. An hour and a half passed and no police showed up. I called my boyfriend so he'd come to the shop, and my manager so that they could watch the security cameras from home to make sure that the man didn't come back. I did the deposit and immediately drove home, with my boyfriend following close behind. Since then, I've been coming into work with the busboy so that I'm never alone, and the managers have been keeping a close eye on the security cameras while I'm working. I've never really shared this experience with anyone except my mom, a few close friends, and my boyfriend, but I don't think that they realize how much it still impacts me. I'm hoping that sharing my story here will help lift some weight off my shoulders. I used to work at an entry-level position at an office in a mixed commercial and industrial area in my community. Most of the other work available around there was manufacturing and construction jobs, so it wasn't uncommon to see people walking around in canvas pants, covered in oil, and looking a bit dingy. I would usually carpool with my mom since she worked nearby, but on this particular day, she called me to let me know she was going to be about half an hour late picking me up. Instead of waiting at work, I decided I would walk to the coffee shop nearby and wait for her there. It was late in the afternoon, around 4 p.m., so the shop was pretty quiet. I was the only customer there. I sat down at a table to read a newspaper, and a few minutes later, a very handsome middle-aged man walked in. He was very attractive and had a comfortable charm to him, but I had to admit, it struck me as a bit odd how clean he looked for this area, especially since he was wearing coveralls and work boots. I didn't think about it too much initially, so when he asked if he could sit with me and chat while he waited for his ride to arrive, I said okay. We actually had a pretty nice conversation for a while, until his questions started getting too personal. There wasn't anything specifically inappropriate, so I just kept talking, even though I was getting a strange vibe. Finally, I asked him what he did for a living. I immediately felt uncomfortable when I heard his answer. He told me he had been working at a nearby manufacturing facility for about a year, and that it was the first job he ever had, so he was really excited about continuing his career there. Remember, this guy was middle-aged. What middle-aged guy is only 1 year into his first job? Especially in an area where I can't imagine there are many people with rich parents or who are trying to pursue prolonged education. On top of that, he looked way too clean to be working where he claimed. Nothing was adding up. I started texting my mom under the table to let her know that I was getting freaked out and she needed to come as soon as possible. I continued our conversation as if nothing was wrong, but deep down I was really regretting telling him anything about myself. When my mom pulled into the parking lot, I said goodbye and hopped into the car as quickly as possible. As she pulled away, I saw him leave the coffee shop and get into his own car. I start freaking out, realizing that his story about waiting for a ride was a lie the whole time. I explained the whole experience to my mom and she sped off down the street. Soon enough, we noticed someone following behind. It was the same man in his car. She purposely started taking sudden turns down bizarre side streets, driving in circles around the neighborhood. He followed us for about half an hour before he finally gave up. We were so shocked that we didn't even think to report the experience to police. I did my best to continue on with my life, shaking it off as if nothing had happened. About a week later, my mom pointed out a story on the front page of the newspaper. The picture for the article was the same man from the coffee shop. He had kidnapped a woman and shoved her into the trunk of her own car and drove about 200 miles to another city with her in the trunk the whole time. When he finally stopped, he forced her to withdraw all the money from her bank account and then abandoned her there with no wallet and no vehicle. Fortunately, the woman wasn't physically injured or sexually assaulted, but I can only imagine how traumatic it must have been to be stuck in her own trunk, having no idea what this man was going to do to her. It's been about 7 years since this happened, and I still have serious trust issues when it comes to strangers. I didn't work in that area for much longer. It was too difficult for me. I used to go to that coffee shop every day during my lunch breaks, but I haven't been back since then. When I was about 12, my great-uncle John came from the Ukraine to visit us in Canada. He had a lot of stories to tell during his visit, but this one always stuck with me. In the late 1960s, John was traveling by train to visit family. He had to change trains at one point and was dropped off at a pretty minimalist station, basically just a platform and a small hut in the middle of nowhere. There was no one else at the station, and the only sign of nearby life was a dirt road that led off into the surrounding woods. He waited for quite a while, but no trains came by. This was during the winter, and he started to worry as it got colder and darker outside. Just when he was trying to plan out where he would sleep and what he would eat, an old woman wandered onto the platform. When he told her what train he was waiting for, she said there wouldn't be another one until the following day. She seemed kind, so when she asked if he needed a meal and a bed for the night, he obliged. Lodging with locals was more or less the standard when traveling in this part of the USSR, and John wasn't looking forward to being cold and hungry all night, so he was happy to take her up on her offer. The walk ended up being almost twice as long as the hour the woman had initially quoted, so by the time they arrived at her small 2-story home, John was tired and hungry. They went inside and the woman lit some oil lamps and warmed up some borscht for them. It was the first time John was able to see the woman clearly, and he was a bit startled to realize that the old woman was actually a man. He didn't want to pry and was too tired to care, so he just finished his soup and asked where he would be sleeping. She led him upstairs into a tiny room, which was surprisingly bare, except for a single bed and one window. He thanked her and said goodnight as she closed the door. He could hear her lock it, leaving him alone in the dark. This frightened him a bit, so he called out to her, but she didn't answer. He tried to think it off, figuring she may have locked the door out of habit. John set his suitcase down and laid down on the bed, determined to get some sleep. Before he drifted off, he felt the urge to pee and got out of bed, hoping to find a chamber pot or something in the room he could use. He got onto his hands and knees, feeling under the bed in the darkness. Instead of finding a chamber pot, though, he felt what was clearly a human body. Immediately knowing he had to escape somehow, he hurried to the window to see if he could climb out. It was nailed shut. He knew he would probably be a dead man if he remained in the room, but breaking the window would draw too much attention. So he did the only thing he could think to do. He pulled the body from under the bed, heaved it onto the mattress, and covered it with a blanket. Then he climbed under the bed and waited. Sure enough, about an hour later, he heard footsteps sneaking up the stairs towards his room. The lock clicked and the knob turned slowly. John could see the outline of someone move towards the bed in the moonlight coming through the window. Then he heard several sickening thuds. The person had bashed the body on the bed with a large crowbar, which they then dropped onto the floor, right in front of John. There were a few moments of silence before the person left the room, closing the door behind them. After the footsteps down the stairs stopped, there was silence again. John moved out from under the bed and grabbed the crowbar to pry open the window. He didn't show fear while retelling the story, but I can only imagine how horrified he was at this point. When the window was finally up, he threw his suitcase outside and then jumped out himself, not caring what was below him, only worried about what was behind. He landed without too much injury and ran into a field behind the house, towards some lights he saw in the far distance. Luckily, the lights turned out to be a highway with some military and transport trucks, so John was able to get a ride to another village where he could catch a train. He didn't bother reporting what had happened to the authorities. During that time in the USSR, there was a pretty good chance that he would have been the one in trouble. With that in mind, he just thanked God he was able to escape, and decided to take a different route the next time he traveled to visit relatives. I want to share this experience from last night because it was creepy as hell, and I'm hoping some people can learn from it. This is a precautionary tale. I fully recognize that this was my fault, but maybe if I can help one other person by telling my story, then it was worth it. I typically don't drink as a general rule, but once a month or so I'll go out with friends and binge. My friends and I had a great night at a bar in the city. I was chatting up a cute guy when the night was winding down, so I let my friends leave without me. We ended up going back to his place, and post-coitus, which was very unsatisfying for anyone who's interested, I was ready to head home. I called an Uber to pick me up since I had no idea exactly where in the city I was. I must have had awful service because the request for a ride was taking forever. I decided to cancel it and try again. Shortly after, a car pulled up to the apartment. I was still pretty intoxicated, so I figured it was my Uber and hopped in. This was a huge mistake. I didn't so much as check my app to see if my Uber was expected to arrive yet. The guy pulled away from the apartment and we started chatting. As I was fumbling in my bag for a cigarette, I noticed that we were headed onto the highway, but in the opposite direction of my place, and we were flying at a solid 90 miles per hour. That's when I got a call from my Uber driver. He was at the apartment, and I was not, because I was stuck in a car with a fucking nutcase. I texted my friend, frantically counting off mile markers for her, hoping she would somehow be able to determine my location. I quickly realized that this was likely useless because she was also still drunk from our night out. I realized the guy is crazy because he won't let me out of the car, so when I finally decided to call 911, I was careful to do it slyly. I had been in the car for 40 minutes now and I was terrified. I didn't know where I was or who this guy was, and we were driving at over 100 miles per hour, weaving in and out of traffic. The driver started smoking a blunt and yelling at me to hang up my phone call. I didn't want to do anything that might provoke a violent reaction from him, so I tried to chat with the 911 dispatcher as if they were a friend of mine, praying that they would catch on. "Hey girl, it's me. Yeah, I'm with someone right now. We're driving past exit 12. No, sweetie, it's not my Uber. I thought it was, but it's not. It's a shame you can't come and meet me and bring friends." Thank fuck the operator caught on. He got me to stay on the phone while he sent cops after us, and we came up with a code. He told me that when I saw cops on the highway, I should casually put my hand out the window, which should seem relatively normal since I was smoking a cigarette. We pulled into a random little housing complex, and the driver busts out some powder and forms 2 lines on his dashboard. Now, I had confirmation he was on drugs, which probably meant he was emotionally volatile. I did my best to relay this to the 911 operator without drawing too much attention from the guy in the front seat. Soon enough, I could see lights from the cop cars approaching, so I start waving my hand out the window. At this point, I didn't care if he was onto me or not. I had no idea if he had a weapon, but just in case, I slumped down in my seat as cop cars surrounded us. They pulled him out of the car, and once it was safe, they got me out as well. They whisked me to the hospital for a drug test and evaluation, and during the ride there, the cop revealed to me that my crazy driver had been in federal prison for about 30 of his 40 years on Earth, all for violent offenses. Luckily, that's where my story ends. I want people to learn from my mistakes. Always double-check your Uber before getting in. If anything goes wrong, call 911 immediately and stay on the line. Hopefully, with this advice, you can avoid getting into a situation like I was in. As a bit of background to this story, I'm a 19-year-old woman, 4'11" and 125 pounds. Not exactly the most intimidating girl out there. Usually, this isn't a problem though. I live in a small city in a rural province in Canada. This happened a few weeks ago, and I've debated sharing it due to the discouragement of my police officer father. But since the case is no longer active, I wanted to share it and get it off my chest and hopefully move on with my life. I was planning on meeting my friend Jay at her place, where she lived alone in a small apartment building. I told her I'd swing by after my exam at the local university, expecting that I'd be done around 8 p.m. I ended up finishing up early, though, and headed to the apartment, texting her to let her know I was on my way. She responded saying she was still at her boyfriend's place and probably would be home late, welcoming me to let myself in with my spare key. I headed inside and did a few things around the apartment. Swept the floor, watched some TV, treated myself to a glass of wine, or 3. Jay's apartment was closest to the outside door, and the walls were paper thin, so you could really hear whenever someone entered the building. About 30 minutes after arriving, I heard Jay's voice and a man greeting her at the door. I was immediately on high alert when I remembered Jay telling me about this creepy guy in her building who she would always joke was going to murder her one day. She's a very pretty, blonde, blue-eyed, small girl, so unfortunately, she attracted a lot of unwanted attention from dudes like this. I could hear the guy asking my friend about her day. The conversation seemed pretty normal, so I tried to relax, thinking I'm just being paranoid from reading scary stories online so much recently. Then I heard the guy ask my friend if she's home alone, which put me right back at high alert. My creep senses were going crazy at this point, and I was ready to enter mama bear mode. I started to get up when I heard muffled screams and thrashing. I felt like I was in the fucking Twilight Zone, and all I could think of was my dad saying in his most police officer tone, "Go for the eyes, go for the eyes." I didn't pause for a second to text anyone or call 911. I just shoved my keys between my fingers and burst out into the hallway. The guy had his hand around Jay's mouth and waist and was pushing her towards his apartment door. I swear I shoved my keys so far into this guy's eye socket I must have blinded him. He dropped Jay instantly and ran for the door. She was obviously pretty shaken up as multiple neighbors started coming out into the hallway to see what was happening. I told my dad what happened and he started investigating. Apparently, the guy had used a fake name on the lease and never ended up returning to the apartment. The The most fucked up part of the whole situation, though, was that my dad found pictures of me, Jay, and Jay's old roommate plastered around the guy's apartment. The only other things that were in there were a dirty mattress, some rope, and a scalpel. All I can think is that I'm extremely grateful with how things turned out, and that I was home to rescue my friend.